about being a twin is it makes you an expert at spotting favoritism. If this cookie was even slightly bigger than my cookie, I had questions. And clearly, I wasn't starving. When I became a psychologist, I began to notice favoritism of a different kind. And that is how much more we value the body than we do mind. I spent 9 years at university earning my doctorate in psychology. And I can't tell you how many people I look at my business card and say, oh, a psychologist, not a real doctor. As if it should say that on my card. This favoritism we show the body over the mind. I see it everywhere.
I recently was at a friend's house and their 5-year-old was getting ready for bed. He was standing on a stool by a sink, brushing his teeth, and he slipped and scratched his leg on the stool and he fell. He cried for a minute, but then he got back on the stool and reached out for a box of bandage to put on his cut. Now this kid could barely tie his shoelace, but he knew how to cut a cut so it does not become infected. And you have to care for your teeth by brushing twice a day. Well, all know how to maintain our physical health and how to practice a dental hygiene, right? We know it since we were 5-year-old. But what do we know about maintaining our psychological health? Well, nothing. What do we teach our children about emotional hygiene? Nothing. How is it we spend more time taking care of our teeth than our minds? Why is it our physical health more important to us than our psychological health? You know, we sustain psychological injuries even more often than we do physical ones. Injuries like failure or rejection or loneliness, and they can also get you worse if we ignore them. And they can impact our lives in dramatic ways. And yet, even though they are scientifically proven techniques we could use to treat these kinds of psychological injuries, we don't. It does not even occur to us that we should. Oh, you are feeling depressed? Then shake it off. It's all in your head. Can you imagine saying it to somebody with a broken leg? Just walk it off. It's all your leg.
It is time to close the gap between our physical and our psychological health. It is time to make them more equal, more like twins. Speaking of which, my brother is also a psychologist, so he's not a real doctor either. We didn't study together. Though, in fact, the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life is to move across Atlantic to New York City to get my doctorate in psychology. We were apart then for the first time in our life, and the separation was brutal for both of us. But while he remained among the family and friends, I was alone in a new country. We missed each other terribly, but international phone calls were really expensive then, and we could only afford to speak 5 minutes a week. When our birthday rolled around, it was the first time we couldn't be spending together. We decided to splurge, and that week we would talk for 10 minutes. I spent morning pacing around my room, waiting for him to call, and waiting and waiting. But he didn't ring. Given the time difference, I assumed, okay, he's out with friends. He will call later. There were no cell phones then, but he didn't. And I began to realize after being away for over 10 months, he no longer missed me the way I missed him. And I know he would call me in the morning. But that night was one of the saddest and longest nights of my life. I woke up the next morning, I glanced down at the phone and I realized I had kicked it off the hook. When I'm facing the day before, I stumbled out of bed. I put the phone back on the receiver and it rang a second later. And it was my brother. And boy, was he pissed. It was the saddest and longest night of his life as well. I tried to explain what happened, but he said, I don't understand. If you saw I wasn't calling you, why don't you just pick up the phone and call me? He was right. Why didn't I call him? I didn't have an answer then, but I do today. And it was a simple one: loneliness.
Loneliness creates a deep psychological loop, one that distorts our perception and scrambles our thinking. It makes us believe those around us care much less than they actually do. It makes us really afraid to reach out because why set yourself up for rejection in a heartache when a heart is already aching more than you can stand? I was in the grips of real loneliness back then, but I was surrounded by people all day. So it never occurred to me, but loneliness is defined purely subjectively. It depends solely on whether you feel emotionally or socially disconnected from those around you. And I did. There's a lot of research on loneliness, and all of it is horrifying. Loneliness won't just make you miserable, it will kill you. I'm not kidding. Chronic loneliness increases your likelihood of an early death by 14%. 14%. Loneliness causes high blood pressure, high cholesterol. It even suppresses the functioning of your immune system, making you vulnerable to all kinds of illness and diseases. In fact, scientists have concluded that taken together, chronic illness poses a significant risk for your long-term health and longevity as cigarette smoking. Now, cigarette packets come with warning saying this could kill you, but loneliness doesn't. And why it's so important? We prioritize our psychological health, that we practice emotional hygiene. Because you can't treat a psychological load if you don't even know you are injured. Loneliness isn't the only psychological load that distorts our perceptions and misleads us. Failure does that as well.
I once visited a daycare center where I saw three toddlers playing with identical plastic toys. You had to slap the red button and a cute doggy would perform. One little girl tried pulling the purple button, then pushing it, and then she just sat back and looked at the box, with her lower lip trembling. The little boy next to her watched this happen, then turned to his box and burst into tears without even touching it. Meanwhile, another little girl tried everything she could think of, until she slapped the red button. The cute doggy popped out, and she squealed with delight. So three toddlers with identical plastic toys, but with very different reaction to failure. The first two toddlers were perfectly capable of sliding a red button. The only thing that prevented them from succeeding was their mind tricked them into believing they would not. Now, adults get triggered this way as well as all the time. In fact, we all have a default set of feelings and beliefs that get triggered whenever we encounter frustration and setbacks. Are you aware of how your mind reacts to failure? You need to be, because if your mind tries to convince you you are incapable of something and you believe it, then like those two toddlers, you will be begin to feel helpless and you will stop trying too soon, or you will not even try at all. And then you will be even more convinced you cannot succeed. You see that's why so many people function below their actual potential, because somewhere along the way, sometimes a single failure convinced them they could not succeed, and they believed it. Once we become convinced of something, it is very difficult to change our mind.
When I was teenager with my brother, we were driving with friends down a dark road at night when the police car stopped us. There had been a robbery in the area. They were looking for suspects. The officer approached us and he shined his flashlight on the driver, and then on my brother in the front seat, and then on me. And his eyes opened wide and he said, "Where have I seen you face before?" And I said, "In the front seat." But that made no sense to him whatsoever. So now he thought I was on drugs. So he drags me out of the car and he searches me. He marches me over to the police car, and only when he verified that I don't have a police record could I show him I had a twin brother in the front seat. He was convinced I was getting away with something. Our mind is hard to change once we become convinced. So it might be very natural to feel demoralized and defeated after you fail, but you cannot allow yourself to become convinced when you can't succeed. So you have to fight the feeling of selflessness. You have to gain control over the situation, and you have to break this kind of negative cycle before it begins.
Our minds and our feelings, they are not trustworthy friends without their bearer. They are more likely a really moody friend who can totally support you 1 minute and really unpleasant the next. I once worked with this woman who, after 20 years of marriage and an extremely ugly divorce, was finally ready for her first date. She had met this guy online. He seemed nice and successful, and most importantly, he seemed really into her. So she was excited and she got a new dress and they meet upscale New York City go for a drink. 10 minutes into the date, the man was straight up and says, "I am not interested," and walks out. Rejection is extremely painful. The woman was so hurt and she couldn't move. All she could do is call a friend, and her friend said, "Well, what do you expect? You have a big hips and you have nothing interesting to say. Why would a handsome, successful man like that ever go with a loser like you?" Shocking, right? That a friend would be so cruel. If I told it wasn't the friend who said that, it was the woman said to herself, and that's something we all do. Especially after a rejection, we all start thinking of all our faults and all our shortcomings. What we wish we were, what we wish we weren't. We call ourselves names, maybe not as harshly, but we all do it. We all do it. It's interesting that we do because our self-esteem is already hurting. Why would we want to go and damage it further? You wouldn't make it physical injury worse on purpose. You wouldn't get a cut on arm and decide, "Oh, I know, I am going to take a knife and see how much deeper I can make it." But we do that with psychological injury all the time. Why? Because of poor emotional hygiene. Because we don't prioritize our psychological health. We know from dozens of studies, and then when your self-esteem is lower, you are more vulnerable to stress and anxiety, and it takes longer to recover from them. So, when you are rejected, the first thing you should be doing to revive your self-esteem, not join Fight Club and get into a pulp.
When you're in emotional pain, treat yourself with the same compassion you would expect from a truly good friend. You have to catch our unhealthy psychological habits and change them. One of the unhealthiest and the most common is called rumination. To ruminate means to chew over. It's when your boss yells at you, or your professor makes you feel stupid in class, or you have a big fight with a friend, and you just can't stop replaying the scene in your head for days, sometimes for a weeks on end. Now, ruminating about upsetting events in this way can easily become a habit, and it's very costly one because we're spending so much time focused on upsetting and negative thoughts. You are actually putting yourself at significant risk for developing clinical depression, alcoholism, eating disorder, and even cardiovascular disease. The problem is, the urge to ruminate can feel really strong, really important, so it's a difficult habit to stop. I know this for a fact because little over a year ago, I developed the habit myself. You see, my twin brother was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma. His cancer was extremely aggressive. He had visible tumors all over his body, and he had to start a harsh course of chemotherapy. And I couldn't stop thinking about what he was going through. I couldn't stop thinking about how much he was suffering, even though he never complained, not once. He had this incredible positive attitude. His psychological health was amazing. I was physically healthy, but psychologically, I was a mess. But I knew what to do. Studies tell us that even a 2-minute distraction is sufficient to break the urge to ruminate. And so, each time I had a worrying, upsetting, negative thoughts, I forced myself to concentrate on something else until the urge passed. And within 1 week, my whole outlook changed and became more positive and more hopeful. 9 weeks after he started chemotherapy, my brother had a CAT scan, and I was by his side when he got the results. All the tumors were gone. He still had 3 more rounds of chemotherapy to go, but we knew he would recover. The picture was taken 2 weeks ago. By taking action when you are lonely, by changing your response to failure, by protecting your self-esteem, by battling negative thinking, you won't just heal your psychological wounds, you will build emotional resilience, you will thrive.
100 years ago, people began practicing personal hygiene, and life expectancy rates rose by over 50% in just a matter of decades. I believe our quality of life could rise just as dramatically if we all began practicing emotional hygiene. Can Can you imagine what the world would look like if everyone was psychologically healthier? If people were loneliness and less depression? If people knew how to overcome failure? If they felt better about themselves and more empowered? If they were happier and more fulfilled? I can because that's the world I want to live in. And that's the world my brother wants to live in as well. If you just become informed and change a few simple habits, then that's the world we can all live in. Thank you very much.